In the remote forests west of Forks, Washington, winter hides more than it reveals. In December 2017, a 9-year-old girl stepped into the snow to help something she thought was crying. By morning, she was gone, and what searchers found beside her footprints defied every simple explanation. It began just after dawn on December 27, 2017. A search alert went out for a missing 9-year-old girl from a rural property west of Forks, Washington. The temperature hovered near 25 degrees as rescue teams moved through heavy snow along a narrow creek corridor. Their footprints overlapped the child's small boot tracks that led away from the porch and down toward the frozen water. At first, everything looked routine. The prints were evenly spaced, the stride calm, the line direct. But halfway down the slope, rescuers noticed something unusual. Beside each boot impression were 2 smaller shapes pressed bare into the snow, flat, wide-toed, and human-like. They followed these parallel markings for nearly 40 yards before the wind began to erase their edges. The pattern suggested more than one presence, each step pacing perfectly beside the missing child. Near the creek bend, a single purple mitten clung to a low branch, and a camping lantern lay half buried in the drift below it. Its metal frame had frozen solid, the glass fogged with frost, as if it had been dropped mid-movement. The flannel blanket she'd carried the night before was never recovered. The scene felt paused between moments, evidence without motion, direction without conclusion. Investigators documented the area in silence. The only sounds were wind against the treetops and the brittle crack of ice shifting beneath the snow. From the porch to the waterline, there were exactly 3 sets of tracks, then nothing. Beyond the creek, the surface hardened into white glare where no print could hold. What began as a routine exposure case was already unraveling into something stranger. The simple disappearance of a child had left behind physical traces that refused to make sense. And before sunrise had fully broken over the tree line, those traces would become the foundation of one of the most disputed missing person cases in Washington's winter records. Hannah Coleman lived with her parents on the western edge of Forks, a logging town surrounded by dense evergreens and rain-cut ridges. The Colemans' property sat at the end of a gravel road where the forest began, only a few steps from their porch. From the kitchen window, the trees looked close enough to touch, dark and heavy, even in daylight. Her father, Alan Coleman, worked maintenance for a small equipment yard outside town. Her mother, Linda, spent most mornings at the local diner, finishing her shifts before sunset. Together they managed a quiet life built around routine. Morning coffee, wood stacked by the shed, and the nightly hum of wind against the roof. Hannah was 9, an only child, and known in school for her curiosity more than her grades. She collected rocks, built small forts of sticks, and kept notebooks filled with sketches of animals she thought lived near the creek. Neighbors described her as gentle and fearless in the same breath, a child who wandered but never strayed too far. Her constant companions were 2 mixed-breed dogs, Duke and Molly, that followed her everywhere, except into the thicker part of the woods. December marked the coldest week of the year. A winter storm had settled over the Olympic Peninsula, dropping temperatures far below normal and warning of snow heavy enough to cut power across the region. The Colemans prepared the way most families did, stocking firewood, filling lanterns, and checking batteries. For them, isolation wasn't unusual. It was part of living at the forest's edge. The forest started 20 steps from their back door. That was where Hannah liked to play, between safety and wilderness, close enough to hear her mother call, but far enough for her imagination to run unguarded. It was a thin line, and in the final week of 2017, that line became the boundary no one would ever see her cross again. The evening before the disappearance began like any other winter night on the Coleman property. The wind pressed against the siding, and the lights inside flickered as another power surge passed through the valley. By 7 o'clock, the temperature had already dropped below freezing, and a faint hum from the generator carried through the trees. At some point after dinner, Hannah stood near the back window and stared toward the tree line. The snow outside reflected enough of the porch light to show faint movement near the creek. Later, her mother would remember her saying she saw two small figures crouched together in the snow, shaking, crying, and barely visible against the white ground. She called them babies, though no one took the description seriously. In a place surrounded by forest, stray animals weren't unusual. The adults returned to their routines, assuming Hannah had mistaken raccoons or young foxes for something human. But the image stayed with her. A few minutes later, she pulled an old flannel blanket from the laundry basket and took a granola bar from the pantry. Without a word, she stepped outside. The wind carried softly through the open door, then faded as the latch caught behind her. For several minutes, there was no movement except the faint glow of her lantern swaying along the first curve of the path. When she came back inside, the bottom of her boots was wet, and the hem of her coat carried small clumps of snow and grass. She said only that the babies were cold and that they had stopped crying. Her mother brushed it off, and the night went on. In that part of Washington, children were used to helping animals through rough weather. But what no one realized then was that this small act of kindness, a child stepping into the cold with a blanket and food, was the moment that connected her to something waiting beyond the reach of the porch light. It would be the last quiet evening her family ever spent together. Sometime after midnight, the temperature outside dropped even lower, and the Coleman house grew quiet except for the hum of the generator. The dogs began pacing across the living room, circling the door, their nails clicking softly on the wood. Every few minutes, they paused, ears tilted toward the tree line, reacting to something the adults couldn't hear. By 1 in the morning, the sound outside became more distinct. It wasn't the sharp cry of a coyote or the low wail of an owl, but a shorter, breathy sound that came in uneven intervals, halfway between a cough and a muffled whimper. The wind pushed against the walls and carried that sound through the thin spaces in the windows until it seemed to move from one side of the house to the other. At 2 o'clock, both dogs began scratching at the back door, agitated but unwilling to go out when it opened. The cold air that entered was sharp enough to sting. Beyond the porch, the forest looked motionless, only the faint movement of snow sweeping across the ground. The sound near the creek stopped as quickly as it had begun, replaced by the low rush of wind moving through the cedar branches. Inside, frost gathered along the corners of the window glass, forming patterns that spread like veins in the pale light. The clock on the wall ticked steadily in the background, counting down a night that felt longer than it should have been. By morning, the wind had eased. When Linda Coleman came into the kitchen around 6:30, the first thing she noticed was the cold air drifting through the hallway. The back door stood slightly open, snow dusting the threshold. The space where Hannah's boots had been was empty. For a few seconds, the quiet of the house felt wrong. Too still, too empty. The coffee pot sat untouched, the dogs whined near the doorway, and a faint draft moved across the floor. The day was just beginning, but whatever had happened outside during those dark hours had already taken shape. Hannah Coleman was gone. The first clear sign of direction came just after 7 that morning, when Alan Coleman followed a narrow line of prints away from the porch. The snow was fresh, compacted only by the light overnight wind. Each boot impression cut clean through the upper crust, spaced evenly, and showing no sign of running or hesitation. For several yards, the trail carried a sense of purpose, straight, deliberate, and undisturbed. Halfway down the incline toward the creek, the pattern began to change. Beside the boot treads appeared 2 smaller sets of marks, bare and nearly symmetrical. Each showed the shape of a wide forefoot pressed into the snow, 5 shallow indentations at the front, but no sharp heel. The depth and spacing wavered slightly as the slope changed, too even to be random, yet too irregular to belong to anything walking with full human balance. Alan paused long enough to photograph the markings with his phone before the cold began to drain the battery. When rescuers arrived minutes later, they measured the impressions at just under 5 inches long, shallow but deeply outlined at the toes, as though made by something light but steady. The stride length was 18 inches, too short for an adult, too wide for a raccoon or fox. Every few steps, one of the smaller sets veered slightly toward the other, then corrected, as if the two forms had brushed together while walking. The tracks led down to the tree line, where the creek curved behind a tangle of alder and salal. Here the snow became brittle and uneven, refrozen over older ice. The prints pressed deeper in some places and disappeared in others, swallowed by thin air pockets beneath the crust. At the center of the path, a single purple mitten clung to a branch at waist height, its cuff frozen stiff. Below it, the snow dipped in a shallow oval, as though something small had crouched there before the surface hardened again overnight. Search and rescue established a perimeter shortly after 8 o'clock. Volunteers marked each print with colored flags to prevent accidental damage. Drones launched above the tree line, their cameras scanning for heat signatures through the thin fog rising from the creek. Radio chatter filled the silence, the short, clipped codes of trained responders, alternating with static as the signal broke against the ridge. The first thermal pass showed a mild heat anomaly beneath a pile of fallen logs near the far bank. The shape appeared faintly warmer than the surrounding ground, round at the edges and about the size of a person curled on their side. Teams rerouted toward the coordinates, cutting through brush where branches hung heavy with ice. When they reached the site, the air shimmered faintly, and a thin column of vapor lifted from a shallow hollow in the snow. The temperature contrast measured roughly 20 to 25 degrees above ambient and was already narrowing as rescuers took samples from the damp snow before it refroze. No animal hair or organic traces were recovered. Within 15 minutes, the hollow had cooled completely, leaving only a smooth depression in the crust and faint condensation clinging to the underside of the logs above it. For the rest of the morning, teams expanded the search in a grid, calling Hannah's name every 50 yards. The wind carried their voices up the slope and across the open stretch of trees, scattering sound before it could echo back. Dogs brought to the site followed the scent only to the creek's edge before circling aimlessly, confused by overlapping trails and refrozen layers. From the house to the water line, investigators documented 3 distinct paths in the snow. 2 of them ended beneath the ice crust, where the surface had fractured into thin plates of frozen mud and runoff. The third stopped abruptly at the opposite bank, fading into hard glare where sunlight reflected too sharply to see detail. Beyond that point, there was nothing. No continuation, no exit, just unbroken white. 2 days before the disappearance, a wildlife researcher from the county had placed an automatic trail camera along the creek to monitor winter animal movement. The device was positioned on a narrow trunk about 4 feet above the ground, angled downward toward a bend in the water where animals often crossed between ridges. It used an infrared motion sensor programmed to capture short bursts of footage whenever something warm entered its range. When investigators later reviewed the memory card, they found images recorded on the night of December 26th, a little after 8 in the evening, the same hour Hannah had stepped outside with a blanket and a lantern. The first sequence appeared ordinary. Blown snow drifted past the lens in loose spirals, reflecting the faint infrared glow that gave the forest a pale metallic tone. Then, for 3 seconds, a new shape entered the frame from the left edge. It moved slowly, shoulders hunched, limbs close to its body. The outline was compact, no more than 4 feet in height, covered in a uniform blur of dark texture that matched the density of fur. The figure crouched near the edge of the water, lowered its head, and stayed still long enough for the camera to trigger a second capture. After that, the motion ended. When the wind picked up again, the shape was gone. Each image showed small differences. In one, the outline appeared rounded, almost spherical, as if the subject had drawn its knees close to its chest. In the next, a narrow form extended outward from the side of the body, something that resembled an arm or forelimb, long and thin, tapering near the joint. The limb appeared to reach toward the ice crust, and the reflection beneath it formed a faint double image. No eyes or facial detail were visible, only the gradient between the snow and the shadow. Investigators forwarded the footage to the State Wildlife Department for review. Analysts enhanced the exposure, slowed the frame rate, and measured proportions against known local species. The shape's mass and limb ratio did not correspond cleanly to any common animal recorded in the region. A fox standing upright would have shown a pointed muzzle and visible tail. A raccoon would have reflected more heat in the face and paws. Even a black bear cub, the largest possible comparison, would have produced a bulkier outline with distinct ear projections. What appeared in the frame fell somewhere between, slimmer than a bear, heavier than a marten, moving on all fours but balanced in an unusually vertical crouch. Skeptics pointed to optical distortion. Snow particles close to the lens can exaggerate movement, especially when the sensor refreshes between infrared bursts. In freezing air, the glow from heat differentials can create overlapping silhouettes where none exist. Some researchers suggested that two smaller animals might have crossed paths at once, their shapes blending in motion. Others believed the blurred limb was nothing more than wind-shaken brush catching the same reflected light. Forensic specialists extracted still frames to study pixel by pixel. Each image contained minor compression noise, a side effect of low-temperature operation. The lens temperature had dropped below freezing, creating a thin ring of condensation around the outer edge. Within that ring, the blur of the moving figure sharpened slightly at its center. When enlarged, faint parallel bands appeared across the body surface, possibly fur texture, though image noise or lens vibration could also explain them. The timestamp on the recording read 20:48:36, the same window when Hannah had last been seen at the back door holding a blanket. The match was close enough that investigators could estimate her location relative to the camera. Based on distance and angle, the figure would have been less than 60 yards from the Coleman property, hidden by brush and terrain elevation. That proximity raised the possibility that whatever the camera captured was the same presence Hannah had described earlier that evening. The footage circulated quietly among agencies for several weeks. Unofficial copies reached online discussion boards where viewers magnified frames and offered their own interpretations. Some saw two animals huddled together. Others insisted on the outline of a single, juvenile figure crouched low, its head proportionally larger than its body. When slowed to 1/4 speed, the movement pattern appeared deliberate. Slow exhalation creating visible vapor, a pause, and then retreat into the brush. Wildlife experts remained divided. One environmental biologist stated that juvenile martens can appear almost human-shaped when crouched and puffed with snow, their long tails hidden beneath them. Another analyst countered that the heat signature suggested a body temperature higher than expected for a small mammal in sub-freezing conditions. Both agreed that no definitive identification could be made. The camera's sensor recorded only shape and movement. Without color or detail, any conclusion would rely on assumption. When investigators revisited the site weeks later, they found no tracks matching the shape or position seen in the video. The area around the creek had thawed and refrozen several times, erasing whatever prints might have remained. They remounted the camera, hoping to capture further evidence, but no subsequent images showed anything comparable. The footage was ultimately archived with the case file labeled simply as Unidentified Thermal Subject, Sequence 17B. It lasted a total of 6 seconds. Frame 1 showed empty snow and wind. Frame 2, the dark shape entering. Frame 3, the crouch. Frame 4, the extension of an arm-like limb. There were no eyes, no face, and no definable outline beyond the faint curve of a spine and the suggestion of movement. It was neither proof nor illusion, just a record of something that existed for a moment between two gusts of wind. One motion frame later, it was gone. For investigators, the video represented both evidence and uncertainty, the only captured image that coincided exactly with Hannah Coleman's final known movements. To this day, it remains the most examined piece of material from the case, studied, argued, and interpreted without resolution. Each viewing offers the same realization. The camera had done its job, but what it saw defied ordinary explanation. News of Hannah Coleman's disappearance moved quickly through Forks. In a town that small, silence rarely lasted long. By mid-morning, word had passed from the rescue site to the gas station, and from there to the diner where her mother worked. Within hours, nearly everyone had a version of what might have happened, each story shifting slightly with retelling. Forks was used to bad weather, downed power lines, and lost hikers from the national forest, but a missing child within walking distance of town felt different. People came forward to help, loggers, retirees, and high school students on winter break. They formed search lines through the drainage gullies, carrying sticks to mark ground already covered. As they moved deeper into the woods, they began trading stories in low voices, small details that grew sharper with each repetition. One neighbor who lived along the access road said he had noticed movement the night before, two small shapes crossing the gravel near his mailbox just before midnight. He assumed it was a pair of stray dogs and went back inside. When the report reached investigators, they logged it as unconfirmed, the description too vague to pursue. Another resident who lived closer to the creek recalled hearing a series of high, clipped cries, not quite animal, but not recognizable as human either. He had shut his window and forgotten about it until the search began. At the elementary school, teachers gathered what information they could from Hannah's classmates. One of her friends mentioned that she had talked about finding new friends in the woods and that she had made a bed for them so they wouldn't freeze. The phrasing unsettled adults, but it was difficult to separate imagination from fact. Children in that age group often blurred the line between play and reality, especially when animals were involved. Still, the timing matched her disappearance too closely to ignore. By the end of the first week, the case had become a mixture of facts and folklore. Local hunters examined photographs of the strange footprints and debated whether they could have been caused by overlaid prints, one human, one animal, pressed together in soft snow. A retired tracker who joined the volunteer search said the spacing didn't match anything he recognized. The toes, he noted, were splayed wide, as if whatever made them had never worn shoes. But the proportions were wrong for a human child. The forefoot was too broad, the heel barely registered. As days passed without progress, theories multiplied. Some believed Hannah had wandered too far, slipped into the creek, and been carried downstream under the ice. Others pointed to rumors of wild animals drawn in by garbage bins left open after the power outage. One theory suggested she had followed strayed dogs into the woods and become disoriented in the storm. None of these explanations accounted for the bare, parallel tracks found beside hers, or the thermal reading under the fallen logs. The footage from the trail camera only added confusion. When the still frames reached the local paper, the editor published a single blurred image with the caption, "Unidentified figure near search zone." The community response was immediate. Some residents dismissed it as a trick of light, others treated it as proof that something unknown lived in the forest. Online discussions turned the story into a magnet for speculation. The idea of baby Bigfoots entered conversation not through witnesses, but through message boards repeating the same few sentences until they hardened into a kind of belief. For people who lived closest to the woods, the speculation carried an edge of fear. Parents kept children indoors after dark. Hunters avoided the lower creek crossings, not because they believed in creatures, but because they didn't want to stumble on what the search teams had missed. The Coleman property, once just another rural home, became a reference point whispered about in the diner or at the supply store, the place where the tracks had run side by side. Investigators continued to recheck the area, but every visit returned fewer answers. Snowfall melted and refroze, erasing impressions that might have clarified what had moved beside the child that night. With each passing day, the physical evidence faded, while the stories strengthened. Some spoke of seeing shapes between the trees at dusk, silhouettes moving in pairs. Others described faint cries echoing after dark when the wind dropped low across the valley. No two accounts matched exactly, yet none could be proven false either. By late January, the case had left the headlines, but the conversation persisted quietly. In the weeks that followed, people began leaving offerings near the creek: scraps of food, folded blankets, small toys. They said it was for Hannah, though others claimed it was for the things she had tried to help. What started as grief slowly blended with local superstition, a ritual shaped more by uncertainty than belief. Every town has a point where fact ends and story begins. For Forks, that point lay somewhere along the frozen bend of the creek. Everyone had a version: coyotes, runaways, barefoot teenagers, but none fit the size or the shape left in the snow. What remained was an absence that people filled with whatever explanation felt safest. In the end, the disappearance of one child had turned an ordinary patch of forest into a place defined entirely by what might still be hiding there. When official searches ended in early January, the Coleman case moved from rescue to review. The field teams were gone, but the evidence, what little existed, was still being measured and interpreted. By then, 4 main theories had formed. Each one attempted to explain what the snow, the camera footage, and the tracks could mean. None fit perfectly, but together they drew the limits of what was possible. The first and simplest explanation was that Hannah Coleman had wandered too far, become disoriented in the storm, and succumbed to cold. Exposure was the leading cause of death in winter disappearances across the Pacific Northwest. Conditions that morning supported it. The recorded temperature was 25 degrees Fahrenheit, with a steady wind chill that dropped it below 15. Within 30 minutes, bare skin could begin to lose coordination. After 2 hours, even mild hypothermia could lead to confusion and loss of direction. Search and rescue data from the region showed that children who leave home voluntarily often travel downhill or toward water, both of which matched the creek route on the Coleman property. The even spacing of her boot prints suggested calm, not panic, at least in the early stages of the walk. Investigators noted that children exposed to extreme cold sometimes remove clothing in later stages of hypothermia, a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. If that occurred, it could explain the missing mitten and the disappearance of her coat. Yet the exposure theory faltered on one point: the parallel barefoot prints. No matter how confused a child might become, the presence of 2 separate, consistent sets of bare impressions alongside her own required an additional variable. Some argued they were distortions caused by melt-freeze cycles, where sun exposure during the day softens snow and refreezes it overnight, stretching edges outward to mimic toes. The pattern can make ordinary boot prints look wider or incomplete. Others believed that overlapping animal tracks could have produced the illusion. The exposure scenario remained the official position because it fit the timeline and the temperature data. It was logical, measurable, and free of speculation. But it left one question unanswered. If Hannah had simply wandered and collapsed nearby, why was no trace of her body ever recovered within the 10-mile radius that search teams covered repeatedly before the thaw? The second theory involved wildlife. Forks and the surrounding forest host, black bears, bobcats, foxes, and feral dogs, species capable of leaving ambiguous tracks in winter. The faint hand-like impressions near the creek might have belonged to a raccoon, which uses dexterous front paws for digging and feeding. When pressed into soft snow, those paws can create elongated marks that resemble fingers. Supporters of this view pointed to the sound reported during the night, short, breathy cries often associated with fox kits or martens during the mating season. A pair of juvenile animals sheltering under the logs could have generated the thermal anomaly later detected by the drone. If Hannah had followed those sounds to the creek, she might have attempted to reach them, fallen through thin ice, and been swept under the frozen surface. Wildlife specialists examined the evidence with caution. The size and spacing of the prints, at roughly 5 inches long and spaced 18 inches apart, didn't match raccoons or martens, whose 4-foot impressions are much smaller. Canine tracks typically show claw marks and symmetry absent from what was recorded. Moreover, the parallel nature of the prints suggested a bipedal gait, not the alternating pattern of 4-legged movement. A senior tracker involved in the early phase of the search explained that snow can produce a double-step illusion. When 2 animals or 2 feet strike the same area within seconds, the overlapping pressure can merge outlines into a single distorted print. Over time, refreezing exaggerates the depth difference, creating the appearance of longer toes or wider heels. Photographs of the Coleman tracks displayed exactly those traits: deep leading edges and shallow rear imprints. To the untrained eye, they appeared human. To those familiar with snow behavior, they were ambiguous at best. While the animal interaction theory explained many details, it failed to account for the consistent pacing and direction of the prints. Wild animals rarely move in synchronized steps beside human tracks for more than a few feet. They wander, cross paths, or circle. In the Coleman case, the secondary prints remained beside hers for nearly 40 yards. That symmetry remained difficult to dismiss. The third theory was darker. Investigators briefly considered the possibility of a human perpetrator, someone who might have coaxed the child outside or intercepted her near the tree line. Cases of child abduction in rural Washington were rare, but not unheard of. The absence of adult boot prints complicated this idea, yet snow conditions could conceal evidence. If a second person had walked in her tracks or used snowshoes, impressions might not register distinctly. The open back door supported the notion of voluntary exit rather than forced removal. Hannah's blanket and lantern indicated preparation, not struggle. Those details suggested intent, as if she believed she was going to help someone or something. A human lure, perhaps a neighbor's child or an individual calling for assistance, could have drawn her toward the creek. Search teams, however, found no tire marks, footprints, or secondary evidence consistent with another person's involvement. No missing persons were reported in adjacent counties, and door-to-door interviews turned up nothing suspicious. The logistics of a human abduction under such conditions in heavy snow with active dogs on the property bordered on impossible. Even so, the theory persisted in conversation, sustained less by evidence than by the human tendency to seek agency behind tragedy. The final and least official theory emerged from within the volunteer search groups themselves. It was never listed in the report but circulated quietly among those who had seen the footprints and the trail camera footage. They referred to it simply as the unknown juveniles hypothesis. According to this view, the smaller parallel tracks and the thermal image might have belonged to living creatures that were neither human nor known wildlife, young, fur-covered bipedal forms capable of limited coordination. The idea stemmed partly from proportion. The prints were shorter than an adult's, but displayed a stride consistent with upright movement. The thermal reading had shown a compact body heat, roughly equivalent to a small human curled under the logs. Combined, those two factors suggested size and warmth beyond what most animals of that weight could produce. Skeptics countered that body heat anomalies often occur near water channels where warm air escapes from underground flow. The hollow recorded by the drone might have been nothing more than trapped geothermal heat venting through the snow. Yet several searchers maintained that the hollow's shape appeared deliberate, oval, smooth, as if something had lain there recently. Meteorological data complicated the analysis. The storm that night included rapid shifts in wind direction, producing microdrifts capable of distorting snow surfaces within hours. That could explain why the prints seemed unusually preserved while everything else had blown over. But for others, those same conditions made the survival of detailed impressions improbable, unless they had been made shortly before discovery. The idea gained quiet traction when locals began pointing out that the Coleman property sat less than 15 miles from the Hoh River corridor, a region with a long history of unexplained sightings. Over the years, loggers and hikers had filed scattered reports of tall, upright figures moving through fog, strange vocalizations echoing along the Solduck River, and lines of wide, barefoot impressions discovered after fresh snow. In 1998, 2 hikers described a dark figure crossing a bend in the Solduck at dawn. In 2003, a retired ranger recorded a cluster of oversized prints deep in the Hoh drainage before later dismissing them as melt distortion. And in 2012, a road worker near Sappho heard 3 deep calls followed by heavy movement, downslope through brush. None of those reports had ever been verified, but they placed the Coleman case within a map of older stories stretching back decades. To some, the link felt unavoidable. If adults had seen full-grown figures, perhaps Hannah had encountered their young. To others, it was coincidence shaped by fear and memory. Either way, the geography supported the idea. The same valley, the same weather, and the same silence, thick enough to let imagination breathe. The unknown juvenile theory never advanced beyond speculation. It offered no verifiable evidence, no fur samples, no DNA, no consistent witness accounts. Still, it lingered because it accommodated all contradictions: the size of the tracks, the heat source, the missing body, and Hannah's own words about hairy babies crying by the creek. It was a theory that didn't need to be proven to feel complete. It simply occupied the gap left by everything the others failed to explain. By early spring of 2018, the official search for Hannah Coleman had long ended. The snow had melted from the lower valley, revealing empty ground where the search lines once stood. Investigators filed their final notes and reclassified the case as inactive, leaving the conclusion unchanged, presumed deceased due to exposure. It was the only answer that could be supported by evidence, even if it left more silence than certainty. The Coleman family moved away from Forks soon after. Their house remained empty for months, its windows dark, the porch steps marked by moss. The neighbors said little about the decision. No one blamed them for wanting to leave. The property sat too close to the waterline, too close to where the tracks had vanished, and too close to the questions that refused to settle. Life in the valley returned to rhythm, but the story didn't fade. Each winter, when the air grew sharp and the creek began to crust with ice again, people left small offerings along the path where the search had begun. Scraps of food, folded blankets, sometimes children's toys. Some said it was for Hannah, a gesture of remembrance. Others said it was for the things she had tried to help, the hairy babies that might still move quietly through the woods. Over time, the act became a kind of ritual, repeated without comment, part compassion and part caution. By the following winter, the property looked unchanged. The alder trees had grown thicker, the creek deeper from runoff. The only sign of visitation was a faded pink blanket tied around a branch near the bend, a piece of fabric, sun-bleached and frayed, fluttering lightly in the wind. It stayed there through rain and frost, visible from the trail, but never disturbed. The file on Hannah Coleman remains open in name only. There were no new leads, no confirmed sightings, and no further evidence recovered from the creek. But the photographs of the prints and the 6 seconds of trail cam footage still circulate among those who remember. They study the same frames again each year, hoping that something hidden inside them will suddenly make sense. Nothing ever changes. Whatever Hannah found that night, she saw something worth helping, whether it was wildlife, imagination, or something science hasn't yet named, only the snow remembers how close she walked beside it.